We will go on the topic of migration and the global issue. This morning we just come back rapidly to the global maps in order to remind you the globalization of migration phenomena, and after I shall speak about the topic itself. First, all the theoreticians which spoke about this topic, in which way since the end of the 18th century until now, and after which are the political responses, the global ones and the national ones, to this globalization of mobilities. So I just remind you some maps. I shall not comment them because it was done yesterday, in order to remind you some global issues, the globalization of flows, the demographic stake, also the divide between rich and poor and north and south, which is a new bipolarization of the world regarding migration. And after, yes, the access to visas, the globalization, not just of trafficking, but also the last one. Yeah, this very small map just before. Yes, no, yes, this one. It is not so visible. It is also a world approach. It is the signatories of the Convention of 1990 on the rights of all migrant workers and their family. As you can see, except for the former states of Yugoslavia, all signatories are southern countries. And after, the globalization of conflicts too, and refugees, the globalization of tourism. 1 billion people are international tourists in the world. And also some other global topics, which is the important trends, also the remittances, as I told you, with some big countries for remittances, like Mexico, like Turkey, like Morocco, like China, India, and so on, and the environmental problems. So it was just to remind you the situation and to begin about the theories which were, and also philosophical theories, but also law approaches of this global phenomenon. There are some lawyers today, for example, a professor at the University of Paris too, who is named Olivier de Frouville, who conducted a program on towards a global law, vers un droit global. And the question of globalization of the management of migration is also included in this research. So first, as for the theoreticians and philosophers about migration as a global issue, we find first some very old references. The first one was a lawyer, but partly a philosopher, who was observing the colonization by Spain of Latin America. And he was named Vitoria. He was belonging to the group of Las Casas, who was debating, criticizing the manner in which was made the colonization by the Spanish of Latin America. And his topic was which is the right of entrance of the Spanish on the Latin American grounds. And he debated about the right to emigrate in the case of this colonization, and he was also bringing the question of the rights of the indigenous populations, alike with Las Casas. Some others, like Hobbes was a philosopher. He was also a lawyer, and he was working for the Dutch colonies, Dutch companies of trade, which were not yet in this period in a phase of colonization, but they were trading in Asia and Southeast Asia, and he was asking about the right to trade and the right to settle, making a definition between the right to trade for the companies, for the Dutch companies, the interest of the Dutch companies, different in his eyes from the right to settle. And in this period, the distinction between settlement and just entering to trade, to dialogue, was very important, and the most important philosopher about this topic of considering mobility as a global issue is Kant, Immanuel Kant, who wrote a small book which is named the Project of Perpetual Peace, in which he says the world is a globe and the men have no other possibilities than moving inside this globe. And we can define the right to mobility for a short term, for visits, the right of visit, which is different, which is a universal right, which has to be separated from the right to settle, which is including agreements and also the agreement of the state or the territory in which the newcomers are entering. So he makes this definition between the right of dialogue, entering, trading, and which is also discovering, which is a universal right of mobility, because we are the universal, we are a universal citizen. He defines cosmopolitic citizenship in this treaty. Cosmopolitic citizenship is the right to be part of the common universal world, which is different from the right of colonization, from the right of appropriating a settlement into the country, which requires agreement from the territory in which somebody enters. This proposal was not respected, as you know, after, but it is an interesting approach of the universalistic right to move, to emigrate, based on a conception of universal cosmopolitic citizenship. And after, there has been some others which went on in this philosophical and law definition of mobility, such as Hannah Arendt, the right to have rights for the movers, considering those who move have less rights than those who don't move, which is right at world level, and also the recent German political scientist Zygmunt Bauman, who takes his inspiration from Kant, from the definition of cosmopolitic citizenship, and he wrote several books. He died last year. And he wrote several books on the topic of global world and a liquid world, the definition of liquidity. The present world, the present global world is a world of liquidity. All is liquid, the transfers, the knowledge, the trade, and many phenomena, except for the fluidity of the circulation of population. And he says the result of that are many camps, borders, and a lot of unexpected effects, which are perverse effects of this difficulty to move all over the world, in a world which is, under other respects, a fluid and a liquid world. So we have, we have also Ulrich Beck, who wrote a lot extensively on cosmopolitism, which is the cultural way of life, which is a consequence of this global approach of mobilities, exchanges, dialogues, and liquidities. So we have a lot of philosophers, political scientists, lawyers, which are the political, philosophical consequences of mobility. And perhaps the last one is Etienne Balibar, the philosopher, who says, in this inspiration from Kant and from Zygmunt Bauman, we can imagine a kind of co-citizenship at world level. On one part, the citizenship of the nation state, but also the citizenship which is a common belonging and sharing of the world issues, and so more dialogue and more belonging, more rights. So there are a lot of approaches like that, and there is a very strong support from human rights associations. For example, the Organization for Universal Citizenship, which is supported by UNESCO, which has pleaded for this topic, a world without borders, as a philosophical approach. And it is a collective of a lot of associations, including Association of Human Rights, associations fighting against poverty, for example, in France, but also in Europe, the movement Emmaüs International. Amnesty International is part of that, and some other non-religious associations, civic associations, the League for Human Rights, and many others. And they have created a universalistic passport, and they give it to all the people sharing this idea of universal citizenship. So it is an approach in order to go beyond the national approaches of citizenship to get rid of a lot of barriers and to fight for democratization of the right to mobility. We have also a lot of, I reminded yesterday to you, the law approaches. There are many which are treating mobility as a global issue. First, the Declaration of Universal Declaration of Human Rights of 1948, saying every man or woman has the right to leave one's country. But this declaration was adopted in a period of Cold War, so it was in order to mention that a lot of communist countries did not give the right to leave their country in this period, but it did not define the right to land. So it is said by the lawyers as an incomplete definition of laws, because and one of my colleagues from the University of Louvain says it is like the suspending path of the cigogne. The cigogne, it is a big yes, with big legs, very legs. They are settled in Alsace, perhaps in this country in winter, I don't know. La cigogne. There are many in summer in our countries, and they live in Morocco or Tunisia in winter, and they are very big legs, and they like to be like that. So it is like, because we can have the leg like that, but we cannot put it there because we have not the right to have our pass on another country. The suspending pass of the cigogne, excuse me for the translation, but perhaps you will meet them outside in winter here. And another global approach of migration is extension of the benefit of refugee law of the Geneva Convention of 1951, because this Convention on Refugees, defining the refugee status on the proof of persecution or fear of persecution, has been extended in the first approach, like the position of Turkey now, was just to Europe, limiting the Geneva Convention to Europe, because Europe was in this period of Cold War, 1951, and progressively it has been extended in 1967 by the New York Convention to quite all parts of the world, except for Africa, and it was extended to Africa in another convention of the Organization for United Africa, OUA, in 1969. Most of signatories of the Geneva Convention now have adopted all these new treaties, New York and OUA, and so extend the benefit of refugee status to all the world. So it is another global approach of migration, and the so-called Conference of 1990 of the United Nations on the rights of all migrant workers and their families, and also some convention of the ILO about the right of migrant workers at world level. So the juridical approach of migration as a global issue, as well as the philosophical approach on this problem, are existing. There are the basis, and we will focus on the implementation, the difficult implementation of treating politically migration as a global issue. First, we have some international conferences organized by the United Nations, which just mentioned migration, but which were not focused on migration. We have had world conferences, for example, on population in Cairo in 1994, which is mentioning migration among the questions of population as a global issue in this period, and some observers of this conference, which were at the basis of the Forum for Migration and Development, took this argument to develop the question of governing migration as a global issue in a multilateral manner. Second, we have we have been speaking about migration as a global issue in the Beijing Conference on Women in 1998, which is also treating the women questions, but also dealing partly on migration. When we have had the 2002 Durban conference of also the United Nations on discrimination, the question of migration has been put on the table, but it was not central. So we have never had any international conference organized by the United Nations on migration. Why? Because it is a controversial topic. And we are speaking, but I don't know, about a global conference on migration following the events of Syria and all the crisis of refugee for the end of this year, but I did not heard anew about that. It would be a first event. But, and if we go to the other conferences dealing very partly on migration, we have the conferences on environment, the Copenhagen, the Kyoto, and the COP21 in France, in Paris, on last November. But migration is just treated as a consequence of environmental problems, but it is not at all central. In the OMD, World Objectives for the Development of the Planet in 2000, the question of migration was not considered as managing migration was not considered as one of the objectives of the development of the planet, but it was treated in the question of labor and all that. So no real interest in migration. In the recent objectives of sustainable development of 2015, migration is taken into account, but it is not one of the defined objectives of the sustainable development for the planet. And we never spoke about migration in the G8 conference, G7, G8 and G20 conferences, never. So it was just hinted at the recent meeting in Turkey, because Turkey was facing the refugee crisis, but it was not the central point of the this recent meeting. So we can conclude that we don't speak about migration directly in the global conferences dealing with the main stakes of the world. It is the first conclusion we can take from that, because the question of migration lacks of legitimacy. Lack of legitimacy because it is very controversial all over the world, because some countries don't want to abandon their rights of sovereignty to a global approach, which would impose them rules in order to manage migration. So it is the question. And the initiative I was speaking yesterday about Kofi Annan idea to have a World Forum on Migration and Development in order to avoid the perverse effects of this mismanagement led by security is semi-failure, semi-success, for the reason it is a very low process which is on the table every year, because every year there is a World Forum on Migration and Development, but the link with the United Nations is rather weak. The only link is the presence of the General Secretary of the Forum, who is Mr. Peter Sutherland, which is sent by the United Nations in order to follow since the beginning, since 2006, the high-level dialogue on migration and development, the world meetings, not forums. It is not conferences, it is not the same status, forums with the civil society, with the multi-actors phenomenon, the process of making migration a positive issue for all, the win-win-win approach for migrants, for countries of origin, and for countries of departure. So it is a very long process due to the lack of transnational mobilization to consider migration as a global issue with a legitimate place at global conferences, global concerns, because the reluctance of the states is very important. Migration is one of the main duties of the states, and the states in this period of rising feelings of nationalism, security, populism are very conscious about the importance of the issue in electoral terms, in terms of public opinion. If we come back to the statistics of Eurostat of December 2015, the question which is of most concern for the Europeans is migration. Not unemployment, not other issues. Migration for 45% of the population of the panel of Eurostat in December 2015. So the governments want to be re-elected, so they promise security, border control, and which is not in the sense of this philosophical and law approach I was describing, considering migration as a global issue. So the result is the national governance of migration, with a very small participation of the civil societies in this management, with a response to polls, to public opinion mostly, and it is the Far West. The Far West, the management of migration at world level is the Far West, because the most wealthy countries, which are the big immigration countries in the world, are defining by their rules, by their visa systems, the rules of access to the labor market, access of students, access of family reunification, the criteria and all that are ruling migration phenomena at world level, with a lot of discrepancies, mostly the dead in the sea, and not just in the sea, the jails, the walls, the illegals, prostitution, and human trafficking. This is the result, and there has been a lot of field research on this question. For example, a book which is from Michel Agier, A World of Camps. He studied most important camps in the world, and saying we are in a world of camps. It is a global approach of this result of managing migration, starting from Darfur in Sudan to some camps in Calais in France, for example, between the channel where the people are waiting to cross the sea in order to land to UK, for example. And we have a lot of camps. We created new camps with hotspots in Greece and Italy during the refugee crisis last summer, in order to sort who will be applicant to asylum and who has to be taken back to Turkey. So a world of camp. Another approach is Michel Fouché, the geographer, who wrote a book 5 years ago, which is The Obsession of Borders, L'Obsession des Frontières. He says, we have never had so many borders, kilometers of borders as now, since the collapse of the Soviet Union, and we are in a world which is making new borders in this world every day. There has been countries which decided to be divided in two countries, like the Czech Republic, but also Sudan and some others. And we are in a world also of borders. And some other books are describing this policy consisting in maintaining in detention, in retention centers, the population before finding a solution. Another approach also is that described and analyzed about the world of bilateral and multilateral agreements. We have around 300 bilateral and multilateral agreements managing migration in order to externalize the border at world level. And it is making the job, asking to our neighbors at the south mostly, or at the east, to make our job for the nation states to control the border in exchange of policies of development, possible policies of development, in exchange of visas for the most qualified people. But it is an agreement. Most of these policies are not a world policy. It is a kind of trade. And some southern countries have understood that they can trade with other countries and get some importance in if there are on a strategic place geographically to manage migration in money. So the result of that is the very mismanagement of the phenomenon, the Far West system, because if we see the Mediterranean borders, the US and Mexico border, we see that it is not a human rights treatment of mobility. And facing with that, there is a lack of transnational mobilization, as I told you, with strange bedfellows, those who support more going with mobility are not linked together because they have very different interests. The employers and the associations of human rights or the states of emigration countries, for example, and on the other side, the most nationalistic trends of the public opinion linked with the welfare state, some very high welfare state system like Norway, for example, and some other approaches of sovereign states who don't want that norms could be imposed to their management of migration, because it is a demand from the public opinion. So we are, and in spite of that, of this unexpected effects, we are in a world of interdependency. My colleague Bertrand Badi, who tries to see international relations from the south, with a southern approach of migration, says we are in a world of gap, because we are a lot of those who decide are not representing the whole world. The whole world is in the south, and the south has a very small access to words at international events. And what is also the consequence of that is we are in a world of interdependency. What is most important to consider migration as a global issue, which is one of the proposals of the international forums for migration and development, is considering the interdependency in order to avoid the the worst perverse effects. I shall give you some examples which are taken from field research. For example, first, the decision-making process in Brussels, like in, for example, at the World Bank or in the International Fund, is silo. We are considering topics like that in a vertical approach. So there is Mr. Agriculture, there is Mr. Migration, there is Mrs. Women Rights, and sometimes, and so without connections between them. But we are in a world with a lot of connections. So if, for example, in Brussels, Mr. Agriculture does not exchange with Mr. Migration, which is the case, we cannot solve the problem, because there is a link between agriculture and migration, for example. So the same for many other questions. So human rights and migration, the women's rights and migration, and a lot of topics are linked. So if we don't consider a global world or an interdependent world, interconnected world, we will not solve at a global approach migration problems. I take two examples, two or three. The first one is cotton. Cotton is a very important issue for some countries. For your neighbor, for Uzbekistan, for example, it is a national, quite a national production. It is a very important production for the United States, which is very different as a country than Uzbekistan, as you know. But also for a lot of African countries, cotton is very important because it is the main resource. If the World Trade Organization is fixing very low the price of cotton, it is a disaster, creating migration for some countries but not for others. For example, in the US, where the big producers of cotton are subsidized partly by the state, or in Uzbekistan, where it is a national production, the consequence is not the same than for the small producer in Africa, which is facing the very low prices of cotton and the variations of the price of cotton at world level, because for him there is no issue. The only issue is migration. But never it was put on the table that the price of cotton may have an important consequence on entering into mobility for the rural population, for example, because it is not, we can see that from field study, but it is not debated at world level as an important issue. Nobody cares about that. So it has, from some regions in Africa, from the regions of emigration, like the valley of Senegal River, for example, and some other places, the prices of raw agriculture has a very important issue on the fixing these prices as a very important impact on migration. Another example was coffee. Coffee was produced in the past during the Soviet Union in Vietnam for the regions depending on this bloc. And after the collapse of the Soviet Union, Vietnam had there was a decrease of production of coffee because they were exchanging. And the World Bank decided to reintroduce the production of coffee at world level in Vietnam again, because there were savoir-faire, know-how about producing coffee. The climate allows the production of coffee in this region, which is not the case for all the countries in the world. And so there has been an encouragement to an important production of coffee in Vietnam, where the cost of the labor force is very low. The coffee was introduced extensively before, 50 years before, in Central America, because it is countries where the climate allows the production of coffee. Even if the peasant in Central America is very low paid, he is better paid than the producer in Vietnam. So a competition has been introduced with the producers of extensive coffee in Vietnam and of coffee in Latin America, even if the quality can be different. And so the peasants of Central America became ruined with the important production of coffee in Vietnam. So the result, it is a field research which was done on that, has been the very important migration. First, it was for political reasons, because there were non-democratic regimes in this region, but after it was due to the collapse of the production of coffee in these places, and the peasants of Central America began to migrate to Mexico and then to the United States. And now we are in a situation where Mexico is no more an important emigration land, but it is a very important transit land for this population from Central America trying to enter to El Norte, to the United States. So it is an unthought before, unforeseen example, and there are a lot of examples can be treated like that. And now the last example I wanted to tell you is about the entrance of Asian countries, mostly China and India, in Africa. There are some good impacts and some very bad impacts, because the Chinese are proposing to, as well as Japan and India. I had a student in PhD on that. She was from Japan and she studied on the field the consequences of that, and there has been another book written on that. They are introducing, there are various approaches of Africa from these three Asian countries. Japan is asking an investment without requirements about duties from African countries, because the interest of Japan is having more room in the United Nations, and possibly a place in the Security Council. So their interest is very political. There are 42 African states, one country, one vote. And if we are present in this country with infrastructures, technologies, we will have the favors, perhaps, of some of these countries. So it is a political interest, without duties in exchange. The position of India is different, because Indians are present in Africa, mostly in Eastern Africa, and they want to, even if India is also dependent on policies of development at world level, they invest in Africa in order to have alliances from these African countries for their important dossier at the United Nations, and to have support in their demand as countries in development. So it is for global policy reasons, for the support to policies of development from African countries alike and India. For China, it is to have access to raw material in exchange, and to fish, alike with Japan, because they are eating a lot of fish, as you know. So, and wood also. And also rare grounds in order to make technologies. So they bring a lot of, I saw that in some African countries, big roads and infrastructures and sport establishments, football places, and a lot of things, palaces for some presidents of the Republic of some countries. They don't require anything, at the difference with European or US countries, Western countries, about human rights. They don't require anything. They say, we will make you a total coverage in cell phones. We will make you roads, big infrastructures, and in exchange, we want to have access to your mines, to your raw material, to your fish. The result is that, and they bring Chinese workers in order to prepare all this infrastructure. So the population on the place has no access to its own resources, especially fishing, but also the exploitation of wood and so on, and it creates migration, because the population has nothing to do with that. And sometimes they are not beneficiary of these infrastructures. So it is an example of Far West decisions, because they have very strong impact of entrance into mobility of the population with forms of dependencies to China, for example, and it is something which is not managed. If there would be a global management of migration, there would be some decisions like these ones could not be taken, because we will think about which are the consequences on migration of this decision, for example, on this decision on development, because some of them are very good decisions in order to improve the daily life of the population. But in the same time, we have to think about the equilibriums of the country. And the questions are not the same. For example, if we speak about brain drain, it is a very important North-South debate. The brain drain for India is not the same for Malawi, because India is a huge country. If there are 30 million Indians outside, educated population, it is not a problem, because there are many in India. So no impact. The impact is more development in India because they are creating development and work in India. For example, for the imagerie médicale, the medical radios for the hospitals, many Indian doctors in the US are treating with Indian doctors in India for the radio in order for chirurgy in hospitals in order to have the at lower price the comment of the radio which was made the day before using the difference of hours between India and the US, and in one night you have the result and you can decide about chirurgical intervention in the US or not, for example. So it is a good example of migration is creating employment and development in the country. Edition in English, for example, can be treated sometimes in India, call centers and a lot of activities. It is a good example. Chinese are also making work in China for the expatriate ones in the US or in some other places, making new jobs which are corresponding to the demand, qualified and unqualified, in the country where migrants are settled. But in Malawi, for example, if there are few elites, few doctors, if there are more doctors in UK than in Malawi, there is a problem of brain waste. So we have to see that at world level in order to avoid the perverse effects of decision which were not sought at global level. We have to see the interdependencies. We are in a world of interdependencies. If some Western countries decided to intervene in Iraq or in Afghanistan, it created migration not to the US but to Europe, for example. And we are the victims of some decisions which were taken at world level but with consequences on a special place. If there is the very low price of cotton which important consequences on the African producers, it will create migration to Maghreb countries and to European countries, for example. So the interest of the positive approach of treating migration as a global issue would be that the possibility for the men and women to have the choice between migrating or staying on their place, and they have no choice in many examples that I gave you. They have no choice. So we have to have a more rational approach of migration, and if we don't treat this question at global level, studying the interactions between the various aspects of the future of these populations, we will have a lot of perverse effects. It is the situation we have now in the Mediterranean with thousands of dead people, for example. So it is necessary to have this view about interdependencies in order to have to take better profit from migration for the migrant, for the country of origin, and for the country of arrival. And we are not at all in this situation because the arrival countries are closing their borders, thinking no, our problem is security of the borders, just that. The country of emigration are saying we are depending on migration, we want to go on to receive remittances, so we are not in the same positions, and the global interest of some big countries are developing some cultural, some economic activities which will have some positive and some negative effects of mobility. And the last point which can be solved, so the question of the rights of the migrants is on the table, because there are a lot, and we saw that with the various annual forums we have had on migration during these last 10 years, because it began in 2006. we see the discrepancies between the rights of sedentary population and the rights of mobile population. For example, the women in mobilities have sometimes very few rights. The unaccompanied minors is a very important topic and very few rights. The illegals have very few rights. There are a lot of population which are expelled from the world future development. There has been a book which has been written by Saskia Sassen in 2014, which is named Expulsions. We are in a world of global cities. She wrote another book on that topic some years ago, but 10 years after, she wrote a book on expulsion. We are in a world which is making expulsions of a part of its population in the inner cities of these big, in the slums of big cities. So outside the development, the globalization of these big cities, which are taking decisions at world level, we are putting also in situations of expulsions the illegals who don't have access to the borders of the country where they want to come. There are people who are staying for a long time without any rights. We are also a stateless population, 13 million people at world level in Bangladesh, in Burma, in Myanmar, and in some African countries, for example. We have a lot of problems with treating, in terms of citizenship, the rights of migrants. So the interest of this global approach would be to introduce all these requirements in order to allow the access to mobile population for various reasons, refugees, family reunification, workers, students, and a lot of situations of mobility, stateless and homeless population sometimes, in order to avoid the cases of disaster. And also the environmentally displaced person. I finish with that example because we did not succeed to have a universal status for the environmentally displaced people. There has been a first discussion which began in Geneva in 2011 about the displaced, the climate refugees, I could say, and the conclusion was the UNHCR does not want to consider these climate refugees as refugees because they are not persecuted, and the definition of the refugee is based on persecution. So as they are not persecuted, we cannot consider them as refugees, and they will not enter in the refugee situation. They are not included in the, they cannot be included in the definition of the Geneva Convention. So this group, which is named the Nansen Initiative for the Climate Refugees, was the situations, as you saw on the map, are very different in the world. Some of the climate refugees are victims of the climate, of the change of the climate, so desertification, floods, melting of the Arctic, for example, of the Himalaya, and all that. So they are victims of climate, and for them we can have a special protection. And other second definition, it was the program H4, which defines these three categories of climate refugees. The second situation is that they are victims of situations which are existing for the time of the world. So it was very old and it is not new. And now there has been a categorization of them as victims of the climate. but there has, in the Bible, the Noah arch was a catastrophe of the climate. There are the volcanic eruptions, there are the cyclones, the tornadoes, and a lot of, when Voltaire was speaking about the earthquake of Lisbon, it was also a natural catastrophe, not linked with climate. And also the example of New Orleans cyclone, it was not linked necessarily with climate, it was not proved. And some other examples of volcanoes and the Dust Bowl in the United States and Canada of the 1930s was environmental catastrophe but not linked with climate. So the first categories are linked with climate change. Second, natural phenomena of the activity of the earth, which are no proved links with the change of climate. And the third is the displaced people with big works. Like, for example, in China, there has been a program of dams, important dams to bring water in western China, and this created the forced displacement of millions of population. So they are not victims of climate. They are not victims of natural activity of the earth. They are victims, we can consider, of policies which were decided to build a dam in the villages where they were living before. So they are three different categories. And in some fourth categories, there are phenomena which will happen when the state is unable to, or too poor to prevent the situation. For example, the mud invasions, as we had in Bangladesh. Bangladesh is the first country which is threatened with environmentally displaced people phenomenon in the world, number one, because most of the population is spread on the delta of the two big rivers, the Gange and Brahmaputra, where there is a capital on the end of the delta. So they are spread there because the agriculture is rather good with a lot of mud and a lot of water. But when the water is becoming higher, they are invaded by the water. So they are killed people. The agriculture is totally improved, totally ruined. And the country is unable to intervene. So they are perhaps victim of the climate, but victim also of their state. It is difficult to prove. They could plead for the refugee status because they are victim of their state, but for reasons which were not defined in the Geneva Convention. In some other states, like the small Tuvalu Islands in the Pacific region, some islands are threatened by the higher waters. The water is getting higher and higher, and in these islands where there is a small population, 16,000 people in the Tuvalu Islands, the state has managed, in the contrary, to have a preventive approach. So first, limiting the population. There has been a control of the population since 1 century. And second, they manage some agreement with New Zealand to find a shelter, not as refugee, but just as migrant in this country or in Australia, because it is a small population. So the situations are very different. And the conclusion of the experts groups, the groups on the climate change and the H4 program of 2004 has been, there are so different situations of refugees of the climate that we cannot have a universal approach of them. So we will orient ourselves towards regional approaches. But it is not a global approach. It is not a universal view of the problem, and François Gemelle will speak about that because for him, he was participating to these meetings and he said, I have a moral responsibility. And he developed this idea when he gave a conference in Harvard University. He said, perhaps we are responsible about that. He wrote also an article in Le Monde about that. We, as experts, we defined the situation on environmentally displaced people in a so pluralistic approach that we did not succeed to convince on the necessity to have a universal protection for the environmentally displaced people. And so I was in some conferences there, and the orientation is to which is supported by a lot of NGOs like les Amis de la Terre, the Friends of the Earth. We will have regional approaches of the defense of the victims on environment. But regional approaches are very different according to the possibilities of the regions in which they develop. And for the poorest victim in the poorest regions, there will be a very small support to their situation. So we have to view the situation of migration in a global approach which is more efficient than at national or regional approach, because the inequalities between the regions of departure but also of arrival in the world are so different that we need a kind of Bretton Woods of migration. A Bretton Woods taking into account the interdependency of the question, because if we don't take into account this interdependency of the question leading to migration, we will not enhance the rights of migrants at world level. So there is a necessity, and I wanted to end by another aspect in which a global approach would bring an improvement, which is the situation of some countries. The global approach could also stress on some situations. I spoke about Bangladesh, but I shall speak about two topics. The first one is for China. China has 240 million internal migrants, as I told you. So the same number as the number of international migrants at world level. It is huge, 240 million internal migrants and 50 million external migrants in China. And the number for the world is 244 million, according to the statistics of the United Nations of 2015. So the same number, quite the same number. In China, half of them are illegal population. Half of them are illegal in their country, because there is a right to move in this country, which existed before with the Propiska. Some of them perhaps have known that, the Propiska in the Soviet Union until 1994. And in China it still exists, because we had, and the researchers of the Academy of Sciences of China are trying to mobilize on this question, also the international experts, because the government does not want to change that, because it makes products very cheap in China with these illegals, because they have no rights. When they decide to move by themselves from the countryside to the city, all the rights, the social rights, educational rights, housing rights, health rights are linked to the place where you were born. Imagine the situation for a big country like that, but also for each country. So you cannot move without the authorization, or if there is a big dam or public infrastructure, you cannot move from your place if you are a rural inhabitant. And so for a lot of people, they are illegal in their country, so they are working with very cheap labor force, and it makes the production of China for export very interesting. So it is, and the global approach could put the focus on this question, for example. We have other examples of human trafficking. The forum tries to to put the focus on human trafficking, on the situation of women in migration, for example, because there are a lot of problems of prostitution and trade of women in situations of migration. We have also the question of unaccompanied minors, for whom there is a convention, an international convention of 1989 on the rights of children until 18 years old, but in most cases these rights are not respected, for example. So all these questions could and have to be treated at universalistic and global level. Because if they are treated just at national level, it is not efficient, and regional level, there are so big differences between regions in the world that there will be a lot of discrepancies between the rights of those who move. The last example would be the women, the policies of the sex policy in some countries which can lead to migration. For example, I take the example of India and China because they are two very big countries, and in these two countries, added with some others in the region, there is a deficit of 200 million women because there is a choice, sex choice at birth, with abortion or with killing the girls. And so it creates migration. They tell that also in some academic places in these countries, because for Chinese, they look for women, for example, in Burma or in North Korea. So it creates preference for women from this region for various cultural reasons. And in Japan, there is also a deficit of women, and one of my colleagues has worked on this topic. They are looking, the peasants in Japan, who have more difficulties than the urban to find women, are looking for women in China, because the Chinese women know that in Japan she will not work in the fields and very difficult work as in rural areas in China. So there is a movement of migration for marriage towards Japan. So the Chinese are looking for women in Burma or South Korea, and the Japanese are looking for women in China. So there are a lot of difficulties like that, and it creates also other forms. And so the policies towards sex preference at birth could intervene on this question and stop this marketing, bargaining about looking for women in some countries, and these shortages of the equilibrium between men and women in some parts of the world for cultural and economic reasons, for example. And the last one is about the topic which is also debated but which is not seen now, but perhaps in the future, is lacking of migration. What about lacking migration? If we don't have a global approach of migration, it will be also the Far West, as it is now, for the management of arrivals. Because the countries will need those who are dependent on migration, the Gulf states, or the former industrial states with lacking labor force, qualified and unqualified, and other regions in the world confronted with depopulation could lack of migration. If we have to maintain an equilibrium for the countries of departure with the countries of arrival, with this possible shortage of migration due to the stabilization of the population at perhaps 20 billion people on the planet at the end of this century, we have to be very careful about the equilibrium. So it is another question which can be treated at a global level, and that national approaches, even regional approaches, are unable to deal with. So I wanted to stress on this, all these questions which are on the table, which can be treated just at a global approach because the other ones are not efficient. So I shall close here. I have a small book, I have written a small book on that, but in French, which is The Right of Emigration. Which is putting on the, reminding the philosophers, as I told you, and the lawyers who reflected on this topic and the global approach of migration. And also there is in English the books of Alexander Betts, which treated this topic also. And we can also come back to a book of, which is in English, of my colleague Antoine Pécou, which is on the, he analyzed the international discourse on migration coming from the main agencies in the world, for the United Nations, the Forum, from the World Bank, from the IOM, from the ILO, and his conclusion is that all these discourses are very well inspired, but they are tolerating a lot of forgotten questions. And there is a global agreement, but there are a lot of questions which are not raised. And he names that depoliticizing migration. Treating migration at a global level has also some perverse effects, because we speak about the global interest, but we don't enter efficiently in the various interdependency, because we want to have an agreement of most countries on the essential. For example, if we are debating migration at UN level, we will not speak about some question in some countries, as I told you, like that, because it will make the veto of some countries. So there are some careful questions which are not raised, for example. It is, there is a very generous discourse like that, without, so we don't enter in the questions which are raised by Amnesty, by a lot of NGOs. And he shows a lot of contradictions in this discourse about development, about a lot of, and this small book, which was published last year by Palgrave, is enhancing all these topics, depoliticizing migration, by studying the discourse of the main international organizations on migration at world level. So there is some work on that, which is beginning. It is an emerging topic, but it is very useful to be conscious that the nation state is losing in its will to manage all migration issues, and that a global approach, which is entering in all the specificities of the perverse effects of mismanaged migration, can deal better, would deal better with a positive approach of migration.